Testing. Welcome back. How are we all doing? I'm okay, I think. I don't know. Some days. We have to wait till our sound guy gets this hooked up to the internet, because it goes out Facebook Live for people that are home and want to watch it online, or later in the week, it's always up there. But we have to wait till that goes. Does he think it's on? And they can hear it at home? I know at least one person's watching from Florida, so hello there. Sunny, hope it's sunny. Stephanie, wherever you are. Well, my name is Byron. We're here at First Presbyterian Church in York. If anybody who's looking in and wondering, found us online in the John Calvin Memorial Chapel. We're here every week on Sundays. And in our adult ed class, we've been doing this class on peacemaking in the Middle East. It's a little tricky. I'm nervous as all get out, as I've told you before. There's some things I love teaching, and this is hard for me. I don't know why. I'm just nervous about it. So thank you for your patience, everybody. And I think we're almost ready, right? It's on? It's on? It's on. Okay, it's on. Hello. Let's open in a word of prayer. God, we ask you to still our hearts. Help us focus on your love, your goodness, your kingdom coming, and what our church can do to be a part of your work in the world. Help us to learn something new. Help us, our hearts, to grow a flame for your kingdom. Spirit, come and be with us, guide us, and give us your peace. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thanks again, everybody, for being here. I guess I just want to start out with a couple of rambling comments, as I sometimes do. You'll remember just what we've said from time to time in various Christian ed classes that the method or the goal, I guess, of adult ed is always to help us as a congregation and individuals within the body of Christ to grow in the way of Jesus. As Christians, we are drawn into a relationship with God by the Spirit. We're forgiven. But then that is just the beginning of the journey. Once we're forgiven and know we're God's and have that guilt and stuff all put to rest, now the question is, what does it mean to pick up your cross and follow him? To become a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus. And disciple, of course, in the Bible is the same word as apprentice. We become an apprentice to Jesus. We follow him so close that eventually we pick up his ways and learn the skills and practices of living a wise life in the world for the kingdom of God. And so as apprentices in the way of Jesus, in fact, that's what our next curriculum is going to be about, some spiritual formation stuff. It's really, really good. I've been transforming about just what it means to have your lives transformed from the inside out so we become new people serving God in the world, even if we're different than the world. And so that kind of sort of sense of wanting to be transformational, wanting to be deeply spiritual, even though we're studying in this class current events. Some people would say, I've even heard some people say that sometimes our church, we talk about the civil rights trip that some of our people went on and racial injustices in our community or poverty stuff. And somebody says we're woke. Well, I don't even know what that means, but the Bible says to wake up, so I hope we're woke. But, this kind of sense that we address the issues of the world because we're trying to be cool or hip or radical or woke or something. No, we're not trying to be relevant just to be newsy. Because we want to watch the news if you want to be newsy. We're trying to be formed in the way of Jesus because he's the Lord of all of life. And so a public theology is part of our Presbyterian tradition. Most churches would say that, but Presbyterians have been particularly good over the years of having kind of a worldview that invites us to see Christ's lordship over all of life, right? So there's no difference between our little personal lives and our public lives, between the things we do on Sunday when we worship and the things we do on Monday when we vote. We're trying to be a holistic, consistent person committed to the truth and committed to the way of Jesus. And so we don't study topics just to sort of be cool. And I think one of the things that sort of implies this spiritual formation language of being transformed into the way of Christ, into the likeness of Christ that God is working in our life. The fancy word people use for that is sanctification. That we're sanctified in the ways of Jesus and becoming increasingly more like him as we give our lives to the Spirit. One of the things that sort of leads us then is to what I just want to call, this is fancy language that some sociologists use, but we want a thick understanding of the world, not a thin. A thin is just sort of cheap and cheesy, and it can be blown away easily. You know, we think, okay, I'm a follower of Jesus, I'm going to be nice. As if like just being nice is all it takes. I'm going to show up and go to church and be an okay citizen. No, we want something thicker, something weightier, something more glorious, something more that's going to last and be kind of a rich, robust understanding of the world. I mean, you know, and it's always been that way. Some rich lawyer once came up to Jesus and said, you know, hey, we're supposed to follow God. How do you do that? And he says, well, you know, you follow the commandments, love me and love your neighbor. You're doing that. You get it. And the guy goes, yeah, he must have been like a New York or a Washington lawyer. Well, but who is my neighbor? And so Jesus says, okay, I'll answer that. I'll tell you a story. And he tells a story about the Good Samaritan. Now, you know, in that culture, the Samaritans, who were a mixed breed of half-Jews that nobody liked, were hated by ordinary Jews. The kind of faithful Jews that were following Jesus in Palestine in those years didn't like Samaritans at all. And at the end of the day, he's the guy that understood what your neighbor was. Your neighbor was the one in need, the most vulnerable, the hurting. And so this Good Samaritan, the fact that Jesus threw that in the face of the people that walked by the people on the road, was the rabbi and the other Sadducee or Pharisee or somebody. They didn't have time for him. They were going to church. But this Samaritan showed up and loved his neighbor. And Jesus said, that's what it's like. Go and do likewise. In today's language, that might be, I don't know, like the good Palestinian or something, the good terrorist. I mean, somebody that we hate. I heard a black preacher in the late 50s, early 60s, said it was like a good civil rights worker in the Deep South, which everybody hated, the people coming down on the freedom trips and stuff. And so the people you hate are the guys Jesus used as an example of what faithfulness is in that parable of the Good Samaritan. So that's sort of what I'm trying to get at, sort of a thicker, deeper, richer understanding of who we are and who our neighbor is, and what it means that we're informed by this story that the church tries to tell every single Sunday, that we're in a good world. This is our Father's world. It's a good world. But we're sinners. We're all messed up. We're all screwed up. We're all alienated in one way or another. We hurt each other. We hurt ourselves. And that's called sin. And that's why Jesus came to defeat the works of the devil, to defeat sin, and give us new life in a new creation, in a new kingdom that is coming. And so we tell the story of sort of the good creation that's fallen but being redeemed, that all of life is being restored. And we live into that story. So we're people of hope. Again, that's a thick thing. It's not just something like, oh yeah, we hope for the best. I'm optimistic. America's a good country, or Israel's going to... We don't have optimism. We have hope, which is a deeper, bigger, more robust understanding of it's a thick understanding of our life and times. So anyway, that's what Kristen is trying to do, make us thick.
Can we say amen?
Yeah.
Amen.
It doesn't necessarily mean... Yeah. And we do that in community. We do that together. That's another part of the thickness of it, that we're not just little Americans doing our individual thing, but we're bonded into a new family. That's heavy. It's weighty. That'll last. So that's what Krishna is trying to do. So the first week in this civil rights class, or in this Palestine class, we just introduced the phrase pro. We want to be pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and pro-peace. And I said that comes from an organization called the Telos group. Telos means end. The Telos group, which takes people on Middle Eastern trips and helps Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims and Christians and Jews meet each other and eat each other's meals and tell each other stories. And this Telos group is co-founded by an acquaintance of mine. And so I suggested that if you have a computer, look up Telos Group and mess around their websites. They have articles and pages and podcasts and videos and stories, all kind of stuff about being peacemakers and reconciliation. The second week, we looked just very quickly through some videos that Stephanie found on the history of the Middle East, going back to the early 1900s, including then, the stories of Israel being founded in the 40s and taking over people's land and kicking the Arabs out and them becoming refugees, and then them fighting back in the war in 48. That's when the wars started. And then Israel in 67 doing another war and taking more land, and who claims which territory. So that's complicated, and you could teach a whole class just on that. One of the videos Stephanie showed was Arab Christians, because we sometimes think everybody in Palestine and the West Bank is Muslim and Arab, and everybody in Israel is Jewish. So there's Palestinian Arabs in Israel, and there's Christian Arabs in Palestine and the West Bank. So anyway, that was just sort of part of what we talked about. We looked at this theory called the just war theory, which has been in the Presbyterian tradition, goes all the way back to the 2nd or 3rd century, where the church said some believers, the early church for the first 4 centuries, refused to join the army. They went to jail or were burned at the stake, but they refused because they said, we follow Jesus and the way is love. And so for the first 4 centuries, they were like what we would call today Mennonites. The Mennonites kind of get that right. The first 4 centuries, there's no record of any Christians who joined the army. But in the 4th century, the president, or the emperor, I guess, of Rome, was Constantine, had a battle and he won, and he said it was because of God, so he declared the whole country Christian and baptized everybody in the army. And so that's when now, from that point on, you could be a Christian and join the army. Well, out of that theory came this notion that there are times when you have to fight, but if you have to fight, and some people say, no, you never should, that's worldly. But if you think you do have to fight, you have to fight in the right way, in an ethical manner. You can't target civilians. You have to have a reasonable ability to negotiate. You have to pull out any time you can, a ceasefire as soon as it's possible. You can't destroy infrastructure. You can't destroy hospitals or dikes or things like that. In Vietnam, of course, we aimed at the dikes because we knew that if there would be a flood, cholera would break out and it would kill kids. And if it killed the kids, then they may stop fighting. Of course, the Pentagon Papers showed that, and what's-his-name went to jail for exposing all that, but you remember those days when we were intentionally trying to inflict harm on the civilians. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. That's not in the just war theory at all. So in the just war theory, if you may be able to fight, you can fight in certain limited ways with certain constraints, but you can't have all-out war and kill civilians. It's just wrong. So then we suggested that it's just obvious that the terrorism of the Palestinians lobbing missiles into Israel year after year after year for 40 years is despicable and wrong. They aim at civilians. For a while they did the suicide bombings, although that stopped. That was in the 70s and 80s particularly. The second uprising led to suicide bombing. They would go into cafes and buses. Less so nowadays. But that is despicably against any just war theory. And if a liberation army wants their freedom in Palestine, to kill civilians, just wrong. And on the other hand, Israel just bombing the daylights out of Gaza is just wrong too. So I think we as Presbyterians want to hear our Louisville office saying we should be calling our congresspeople for a ceasefire because nobody is fighting fair. Certainly Israel now is the biggest army in the area and is doing the worst sort of tragic killing of the entire infrastructure of everything. So many people have died and it's got to stop. So we're calling for a ceasefire, and if you learn anything, it's that. Okay. Questions about that? That's what we've done so far. Comments, questions real quick? Anything that's burning on anybody, please.
That group that you started, was that founded here?
Telos is in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to show you a video about him in a minute. Yeah.
Did he found it himself?
No, he went on it. The guy that was here last week went on this trip with them, and that's what they do. They take people in these trips. They have people on the ground over there in the Middle East, Palestine and Israel, and they help people get along. Yeah. But that was started. Well, you'll see in a minute in a video. I'm going to show that. The last week, of course, then we did have Chris Clark from our own church who went on one of these Telos trips. When I recommended Telos the very first week, I didn't know Chris had gone on one of those trips. I don't know why we know each other well, but I had never heard that or I had forgotten. Chris said, yeah, I met those guys. I'm like, you met those guys? Then you're teaching next week. And he showed us a little slideshow last week. You can watch it if you missed it, of Chris's own experience eating a Seder meal with Palestinians and Jews in Israel and going to the West Bank and seeing the walls and the degradation there. So Chris can give you a firsthand account. Chris, conservative Republican leader in the business world, and he had this passionate transformation by going over there and seeing how both sides live. So this is a video that explains that Telos organization, and this is a good way to give a thick, rich understanding of what it means to be a peacemaker, particularly focused on the Middle East. Hope this is loud enough. Telos.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about two peoples looking for security, dignity, and freedom in the same land. It is two national groups, Israelis and Palestinians, who are basically claiming the same small piece of real estate as their own, and they do that based on
anti-Palestinian, which means anti-Israel. And in doing that, we have in some ways, very unintentionally, but served conflict itself. We've recruited new people into the conflict. And so we're trying to argue for a whole different paradigm.
Telos is a movement of Americans who believe the only way forward is to be both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian at the same time. And that necessarily means pro-peace.
Telos is a movement of Americans committed to dignity, security, and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. You can't truly be pro-Israeli unless you're pro-Palestinian. You can't be pro-Palestinian unless you're pro-Israeli. You have to look for solutions that work for both parties. Otherwise, we are just sort of doomed to perpetual conflict. But we don't believe that we're fated in this way, that there are ways out of this, and there are good people on the ground on both sides who are trying to create that different reality.
Telos equips American leaders to become peacemakers. We give them the relationships and the experience they need to see the world as it is, not as they'd like it to be, to see the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and how we, as Americans, impacted and are impacted by it. And then we give them the platform to actually do something about it.
One of the real challenges in engaging this work is the common notion that this is a conflict that has no solution. And we reject that. We firmly believe that if good people of goodwill act in different ways, in countercultural ways, in embracing solutions that work for both people, and embracing dignity and security and freedom as the grounding ethos for all people of the Holy Land, there are solutions, and that there are ways out of the mess that they're in.
There's no future for anyone there without a future for everyone there. It's not just possible, it's inevitable if we step up and we play our role the way we're meant to.
Isn't that beautiful? What's it evoke in you? Comments, feedback? Anybody want to say anything that strikes you?
They didn't actually talk about actual solutions. I mean, it's all well and good to bring people
Yeah,
together
yeah,
and to
yeah,
talk about
yeah.
how we should all live, but when you have people that hate each other for
Yeah.
so many years,
Yeah.
you have to come up with some solutions.
Yeah.
And I didn't know any solutions.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, on their website, they've got pages and pages and pages of plans of stuff they do. They've got about a 4-prong approach. The trips is just one of the things they do. But they would say that that's one of the big things, is having real folks get to know each other across the divides, so they come up with a new paradigm, so to speak. And then they equip those people to do other educational work and lobbying and congressional work. Of course, one of the big elephants in the room is that the United States government gives them billions and Israel billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year. And so somehow minimizing the role of the military is part of that. So they have strategies, they have platforms. Todd Detheridge, the one guy is Palestinian, Greg, the first guy. The second guy that was talking is my friend, Todd Detheridge. He was a head of a congressional head of staff for a congressman for years in Washington. And they are two very unlikely friends. Greg is a Palestinian, raised in the West Coast in California, but raised in an Arab Palestinian family. Been a Christian his whole life and cares about his homeland, and is what you might want to say pro-Palestinian and left-wing, if you will, progressive or something. Todd's a Republican, worked for a Republican congressman for years and years and years, and is a Christian. And he basically felt, because he was raised in the Deep South with kind of a fundamentalist background, he believed that Israel was God's chosen nation, end of story. We just had to help Israel. The two of them got to know each other on a trip over there. He was actually there for the State Department. He met Greg, they became friends, he quit his job, started this ministry, and so So I just want to suggest that Todd knows a lot about congressional stuff too, funding and State Department diplomacy and all that stuff. Greg has worked on the ground as a consultant with factions that are working there. So yeah, they don't show in their little promo video all that they're doing, but they're doing a lot. But it still is a good question. How do you actually move forward on this, and what do we suggest? There's no one simple formula. Let's watch another video of them, because they're going to just say the same thing again, but this was at their 10th anniversary. They had this, COVID was going on, so it wasn't a live banquet. They had people all over the world chiming in. And I'm just going to show you the beginning of that. One of the people that's gone on some trips and that works for them is a singer-songwriter named Gungor, David Gungor, who is in a band called The Brilliance. And he plays a song, and I'll let that on too, just to get us a little bit of artsy, fartsy stuff too. And so we'll watch this little video, then Greg, what's his name, will sing a song, and then we'll go from there. Jack.
Yeah, just something that I've been thinking about since you first mentioned it. The idea that some people will say because our church tries to embrace the rest of the world, and because we have a racial justice emphasis, that we're woke.
Yeah, yeah.
And when you said that, I was thinking about C.S. Lewis, who said that when the devil wants to destroy a concept, a movement of the spirit in the world, what he does, because he doesn't have a lot of imagination, in fact, he has no imagination, he can't create anything. All he can do is say no to what God is doing. What the devil does is destroy the word. Okay? And we have a lot of that, and has a lot to do with how we can, in fact, do something that changes things, that these guys are talking about it, is that we need to pay attention to how we participate in that. So you got some people that are saying that Democrats or liberals or Presbyterians they're just woke.
Yeah.
Which just wipes away anything about what
Yeah.
the word means.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the liberal media keep participating with what the devil is doing in destroying the word evangelical.
Yeah.
Which is I'm an evangelical Christian. Thanks be to God. The gospel, which is what evangelical means, the evangel is the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And so to destroy that word is an effort on the part of the devil to destroy the concept
Yeah.
of Christians believing in that kind of conversion,
Yeah.
in that kind of acceptance
Okay.
of the good news that God loves us,
Yeah.
forgives us in Jesus Christ. So anyway, that's my point, is that we have to pay attention to the words that get used,
Yeah.
and when they are used in a way that
Dismissive or
means what we
something.
stand for by making the word into like
Okay.
a four-letter word.
Yeah.
Woke.
Thanks. Okay. Good.
That we need to say no. You're not understanding, and that's the way that knowledge, which these guys
Yeah.
are talking
Good. Thank you.
helps us to change things.
Speaking of words and paying attention to good words, both Greg and Todd use a word in here. I think they both do. They'll notice at one point that we are implicated, and that one of the first steps towards global peacemaking is realizing our own role as implicated in this. Listen when they say that. That's a curious phrase. Anyway, a couple of minutes here, a little more in the telos.
Telos began with an unorthodox idea and an even more unorthodox friendship. I'd been living in Palestine, working as a legal and communications advisor to Palestinian negotiators, and I had what I believed to be an absolutely incredible, outside-the-box idea. I saw a way to build a new American movement. Liberals and conservatives, believers and non-believers, together, fighting not just for equality in Israel-Palestine, but also tackling deep, stuck issues here at home. I saw this multi-faith, multi-partisan movement as missing link to a just peace in Israel-Palestine. And at its center was an unusual, perhaps overlooked segment of American society, Christians. I know for some of you obvious, for others just totally outside the box. Let me explain. I grew up in San Diego, California, Palestinian Christian family. I knew from an early age just how much Americans impacted the reality on the ground there. We send billions of dollars a year. We shape the entire world's political engagement with Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East, whether there's war, whether there's peace in some instances. And we've imported the conflict into our own houses of worship, our communities, our culture, and even our politics. Yet, many Christians who often take such a one-sided approach to this issue had no idea that there are Palestinian Christians. Still today, people will say, when did you convert, Greg? 2,000 years ago? When did you convert? It provides this insight, this cognitive dissonance. No, it's not a conflict about faith, but it provided an in beyond that false binary to be pro-Israeli as anti-Palestinian and vice versa. That this is a Jewish-Muslim conflict, that this isn't fundamentally about human rights. And so I developed a variety of relationships that led me to this unusual methodology for Telos as a result of engaging in a different way. But none of this could become a reality until Todd and I joined forces.
I first met Greg in Jerusalem in 2004 when I was working at the State Department. It was my first trip to Israel-Palestine, and it was during this awful period called the Second Intifada. Israel was building the barrier that so many of you have seen, and some mutual friends had introduced me to Greg, and I spent the first day driving around East Jerusalem with him and exploring the route of the wall and the impact it was having on Palestinians, especially on Christians and Christian institutions. I'd seen photos and I'd read reports, but I was totally unprepared for the reality I saw that day. And the week that I spent there meeting with and learning from Palestinians and Israelis. I grew up in the South, and I spent years involved in Republican politics, including 6 years as the chief of staff to a U.S. senator. I've always taken my Christian faith seriously, and these are the things that actually had shaped my understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What I saw that day didn't match up with what I thought I knew. From that first visit, I was convinced that America had a national security interest in seeing this conflict resolved. I also saw that the significant role the U.S. plays makes us, in effect, a party to the conflict with both influence and responsibility. But I also saw that we often pursue policies there that make peace harder to achieve because this conflict is a vexing foreign policy challenge that functions more like a domestic political issue. And one of the key drivers of that is people like me, conservative Christians. I went back to D.C. unable to shake my sense of implication. And over time, I became convinced of the deep need for a different kind of Christian response, one that was grounded in peacemaking and the calling of those who follow Jesus, the agents of healing and reconciliation. But I still didn't know what to do with all this until I had another meeting with Greg.
It was 2008, November, a week after Lehman Brothers failed in the beginning of the last financial crisis. I was having this meeting with Todd and Foggy Bottom, about to tell the senior State Department official about my crazy idea to build a pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace movement that could bring peace to Israel-Palestine and help heal divisions at home. I went through what I'd been doing over the last year, traveling around the world, weaving this network together, and I told him that there was a unique moment to make this happen right now, that this movement had to begin with some kind of personal experience. The trip, like the one that he had gone on so many years earlier, to get people to really care and to see that we were implicated.
And so we refined and expanded our mission to own supported the work of Israeli and Palestinian peacemakers. You helped vulnerable people in moments of crisis. You told your stories to your friends and families, blogged, preached sermons, made films and photo essays, and written best-selling books like Colin McCann's The Paragon, or at least one of you did, all rooted in mutual flourishing. 11 years into this, we've made important cultural shifts. Pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace is a thing in the cities and churches we work in. Churches are discipling their people to be peacemakers. Many of you forged unusual relationships across lines of difference, working together in ways that are necessary to actually change the status quo. We now have a model that is ready for the moment we're living in.
Like Todd said, we're just getting started. The pandemic threw us all, the entire world, for a loop. But it also gave Telos an opportunity to take stock, to really think carefully about what we're doing and why, to experiment with some new programming. And we want to share some of our thinking with you for your feedback over the next few weeks and for your eventual partnership. We know this moment is an unusual moment for the world and for Telos. We know that the principles and practices of radical peacemaking are needed more than ever before. We know we've built up the assets that can actually really lead our communities and potentially our world to a better place. So with you, we'd like to figure out how we can do that together.
Hey, my name is David Gunger, and I'm a songwriter for a band called The Brilliance, based in New York City. I also work at Telos. I went on my first Telos trip about 10 years ago when I was invited by my dear friend Aaron Nyquist. And I went on that trip and I went back 4 times. It really made an impact on my life. This song I'm about to sing, actually I remember singing it at Greg Khalil's family's house in Betsamor, looking outside at the beautiful sky and this amazing place surrounded by these amazing people. Tonight, I think of them. I think of my friends in Israel and Palestine, as well as my friends in the community here online. Thank you for being with us. This is a song, it's a cover of a song called Which Way Are You Going? Which way are you going? And which side will you be on? Will you stand and watch while
if you want, you can find this Telos program online. It goes on for another hour, and they interview all kind of people and talk about other things they're going to be doing over the years as one organization on the ground, trying to do some shifting of paradigms and culture and bring peacemaking to the fore with their pro stuff. Gungor's a cool guy, and so if you're interested, you can watch more of that because there's a whole lot more. Please, go ahead.
I thought it was a great message of hope.
Yeah.
To endure his glory, you gotta have some suffering. It says in my Bible, my recovery Bible. I was very hopeless for a long time with what I was going through, and I can relate with that. To
Yeah.
what I went through.
Yeah.
As far as in my Bible, in my recovery Bible I read. So, I mean, to endure his glory, you gotta have some suffering along the way. So, I mean, for me to understand that, I thought it was a great message.
Yeah, yeah, thanks very much. You had told me about a moment of desperation.
Yes.
And I think that's what a lot of people on both sides of the Palestine-Israeli conflict are feeling, that there's this desperation. Bombs falling in their homes, awful stuff happening, and people just make unwise choices then when they're under despair, when they're that. And so this offering of hope, this gospel-centered evangelical vision of hope that there can be transformation, has got to be the real final answer, right? I mean, Jesus is the answer, we used to always say. Well, any other things, that song, did it evoke anything for you? Anybody want to share? Go ahead.
I like the part of the song where he said, you say live righteous, but refuse to understand. That was deep.
Yeah, yeah.
And just one hand on the Bible, one hand on the gun. Who am I really?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a message of acceptance, right, of all of the different cultures, beliefs, realities.
Yeah.
Just a message of acceptance. The world needs
Yeah.
to accept others.
One of the things Telos would say is that the conflict in the Middle East, I mean, it's complicated and political and violent, and so, easy little idealistic message of hope isn't going to ultimately solve the problem. We need real concrete answers, but it's the beginning of a shift of change. But also, as we think about how to be peacemakers overseas in this conflict, it has to then kind of spill over to our attitudes here in our own communities, how we think about diversity and stuff here, and people that don't get along here. And in our polarized culture, we need to somehow break that even in our own, be more accepting here. So yeah, there's some conflict, there's some sort of lessons learned from the ministry over there that actually changes the way we do politics here. Please.
To piggyback on the concept of acceptance, what that really means is you have to be able to put yourself in a space where you can challenge your own assumption.
Yeah.
And if you don't challenge your own assumption, you're not gonna be accepting. You're not gonna get anywhere. So it's really an inward look
Yeah.
to get an outward look.
Wow, fantastic. Very well put. On the Telos website, they have a guide for peacemakers, and they have 8 principles or something, and you unlock, you push on a button, and it opens up a little essay about each one. But one of their first principles is a commitment to what they call self-interrogation. I liked how you put it better. But you have to ask your own assumptions. You have to be willing to put yourself in the block and say, is what I believe really true? Is what I'm living really right? So this self-interrogation or criticizing your own assumptions, I mean, that's what education is. If you think you got it all figured out, you don't need to come to Sunday school or church. But this process, I think Jesus called it metanoia, right? To be born again, to be transformed from the inside out means you have to be willing to start with yourself and ask your own self tough questions. So thanks, really well put. Why do you think people don't want to do that? Any hunch?
They'll find the truth.
Yeah. Say that again?
They'll find the truth.
Yeah.
They've never had an opportunity to do it.
Maybe they haven't. Yeah. Arrogance, you said. Yeah, the Bible says pride is one of the main sins.
Well, our politics seems to thrive on pitting one group against another.
Extreme groups, yeah.
And so that they're trying to sell different stories all the time. So it's constant. It doesn't feel like us all getting together would really benefit.
Yeah.
So well, in terms of their storytelling, but it's always a pitting one against the
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
Byron, that website is telos.org, T-E-L-O-S.
T-E-L-O-S, yeah.
.org.
.org. I think it's .org. Yeah, it's an organization.
I just keep thinking of the Robert Frost poem, Two Roads Diverged. Well, which road do we
Yeah.
take? And is there something that can unite those two roads?
Yeah, thank you. Good. Well, I'm sorry, but I want to do a little more. I'm no expert on this, but I want to just mention a couple other sort of historical facts on the ground so we understand the backstory more of all this. I'm no expert at this, but just a point or two of background. You guys have heard surely of Hezbollah. I think is how you say it. We used to say Hezbollah, but it's Hezbollah, which is a radical militant jihadist group in southern Lebanon. Lebanon is north of Israel, so it's up here. In the 80s, Hezbollah was inspired by the Ayatollah Khomeini. So they're those particular kind of Muslims, Shias and Sunnis fight each other. It was the Khomeini branch, Ayatollah Khomeini. They took inspiration from him, and they were trying to push. There was skirmishes and stuff on the border. And Israel started to occupy Lebanon. Hezbollah came into existence in 85 to push Israel out of southern Lebanon. Israel said, though, if we push you back far enough, your stupid rockets won't come into our villages. So both sides were at fault, and it was about a 20-year occupation of Israel in the land of Lebanon, and Hezbollah was started to try to stop that. It goes way back to after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire, that's the Turks, the Ottoman Empire ran everything there. And after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and all kind of European colonial powers divvied things up, and the French had Lebanon. The French were it was called the French Mandate. And so there was a colonial movement to get the French out. The Lebanese people began to take over. There was land debates over the southern Lebanon and the border of northern Israel. The 67 war, the Six-Day War, they sometimes called it, but some of us lived through that. It was almost all the Arabs against Israel, and Israel miraculously pushed them back. And so they took some of the land, annexed some of the land in that battle, and they said, we won it in the battle, and so we're staying here. So Israel was occupying southern Lebanon. Hezbollah, inspired by Khomeini then eventually, says no, and Hezbollah, it did terrible stuff, and Israel demolished Lebanon. It is exactly what's happening now in Gaza, although the names have changed, and it's Hamas. Curiously enough, when Israel took their own land in the 1940s, after the Holocaust and so forth, they started Israel as a new nation. They kicked the Arabs out. Many of the Arabs in the West Bank fled to Lebanon, where Israel occupied them for 20 years in the 80s and the 90s. Eventually, that sort of settled down a little bit, and now it's Gaza, and it's Hamas. Hamas is not inspired. They're jihadists as well. They're less inspired by Khomeini. They were inspired by bin Laden. And so they're that sort of radical Muslim. They were inspired by a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood started in Egypt. So you've got all these sort of pan-Arab, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, of course, is up there in the north. Persia was over here. That's Iran from the Bible days. And so you just have this complication that Hezbollah was founded in 1985. I just want to say that. And what happened in Lebanon in the 80s, there was eventually a civil war between the army of Lebanon and Hezbollah's army. They got their arms from Iran. And Hezbollah's army is bigger than the national army. So Lebanon kind of has two armies. They have Hezbollah's army and they have their own army. And there was a civil war that went on for ages. Now, I just got to say this parenthetically because this is just a kind of interesting detail. There is a Presbyterian Bible scholar who is renowned as one of the most important Bible scholars of the 20th century. He's friends with N.T. Wright, named Kenneth Bailey. He came out of Pennsylvania and was a missionary for the Presbyterian Church in Cairo for almost all of his adult life. He came back to Pennsylvania when he retired. He became a dear friend and mentor, sort of. Kenneth Bailey's written all kind of Bible study books. But he lived in Beirut in those years. And he would come to the States and teach Bible conferences and missionary conferences for Presbyterians mostly in western Pennsylvania. And then he would go home to Egypt or to Lebanon. And he told me once that he had his children, who were young at the time, laying on the ground under the picture window because the bullets would fly through their windows. And he was under it, and he's doing Bible translations on the story of the parables. Like he's written books on the Bible. And he's writing his Bible stuff literally in the dark because there's no power anymore because of the war, in the midst of a civil war in Beirut with Hezbollah and the Lebanese army fighting there in the 90s. So that was what was going on there. But Ken Bailey is the first one that brought that alive to me because I knew him and he lived there so many years. Presbyterians had a mission there in Lebanon in the midst of all that. In the West Bank, you've heard of the West Bank, that's over by the Jordan River. The West Bank is run by the PLO. Many of us are old enough to remember Arafat, right? Again, the Palestinian Liberation. They would take over airplanes, they would do terrorist acts, and at one point, he decided that the terrorism stuff wasn't going to work. And he became primarily a secular government. He was Muslim, but it wasn't driven by a jihadist sort of thing. And the PLO went to the White House and shook hands with Rabin, who was at the time the Prime Minister of Israel. And the PLO said, we will allow Israel to exist. They've never said that before. And Rabin said, and we'll protect your land. How it's going to work out is going to take years to figure out the exact borders, which cities, where the rules are going to go. But in principle, we're going to agree. It was called the Oslo Accords. PLO at that point had shaken hands with an Israeli. Hamas in the West Bank said, you're done. You've sold out. You're part of the complicit with the Israeli attackers. We're never going to deal with you. And a war breaks out between the West Bank, PLO, and Hamas in Gaza Strip. Do you follow that? So PLO is in the West Bank. They become more moderate and want to broker a deal, and they shake hands with Rabin, and within a year, you know what happened next? Right-wing Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox Jews started protesting, and eventually one murdered Rabin because they said, you've shaken hands with the PLO, the terrorists. So both the Hamas terrorists and the Israeli far right, of which not the current prime minister was a part of that movement then, and he became the president after they killed Rabin. What's his name? Netanyahu became the prime minister. He only lasted a year, but he kept the right-wing anger going. It goes voted out. He gets voted back in again, and of course he's the guy now. So it went from Rabin, who was trying to be a peacemaker, willing to shake hands with Arafat. Hamas attacks Arafat and eventually shuts him up in his home. They wouldn't let him leave, and he died there. So now we have Hamas as the sort of big voice in the West, in the Gaza, and in the West Bank you have the PLO, which is trying to run things. Well, then they have to have an election of who, because they're still the same. They're still Palestine. There's kind of two departments of the same country, so they have to have an election. Somebody asked the first week, well, if Hamas is so terrorist, so bad, so wanting to just blow everybody up, well, why would people vote for them? It's a good question, isn't it? Because they got elected. You want to know how that happened? Here's my hunch on this. Some of you may know more about this than I do. This was in 2011. PLO has now become sort of a moderate voice in the West Bank. They're terribly disorganized. They're a mess. Arafat has died. They have a new prime minister. Hamas is organizing over here in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip. They run a guy for office, for an elected official. West Bank PLO party, it's sort of two parties within the same country, ran 9 candidates. Now just think of how that works. Everybody wanted the PLO, hardly anybody wanted Hamas. Like, I don't know, 15, 20% of the people voted for Hamas. People voted for this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, so nobody had enough votes. It was just this sort of the way we think sometimes a third party in America might drain votes from either the Republicans or the Democrats. No, they were so disorganized that they ran 9 candidates, and they were also stubborn and ideological that none of them would back out, so they all took, 10% of the vote, and that wasn't enough to...